Welcome to another episode of Faith Gateway Live. My name is Lori McClure, and I'm so happy to have Devin Brown, the author of Discussing Mere Christianity, with us today. Before I begin, I want to remind you, if you haven't been on one of our live events before, you can leave your comments right below this live page in the discussion questions below. We'd love to hear from you. We want to hear all of your questions. It's great to see you interacting with one another in this conversation. So right below the screen is the live fire comment section. So leave your comments and questions right there. Also, you can get 10% off plus free shipping of Discussing Mere Christianity using the code DB10 at store.faithgateway.com. Okay, so that's 10% off plus free shipping at store.faithgateway.com. Also, Discussing Mere Christianity is available to watch on Study Gateway. If you're not a member, you can get a 30-day free trial, so there's nothing to risk on that. Devin Brown grew up on the south side of Chicago. He and his wife Sharon and their enormous 18-pound cat, Mr. Fluff, who's also Devin's writing partner. They live in Lexington, Kentucky, where Devin is a professor of English at Asbury University. There he teaches a course on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien that I wish that I could audit. He's the author of many books, including A Life Observed, a spiritual biography of C.S. Lewis, Hobbit Lessons, a map of life, life's unexpected journeys, The Christian World of the Hobbit, and Tolkien, how an obscure Oxford professor wrote The Hobbit and became the most beloved author of the century. Welcome, Devin. We are so happy to have you here with us today.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Okay, maybe it was just the love of Narnia and Aslan, as it is for so many of us, and so many of us can agree upon that. But what started you studying the life and writings of C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, I'll tell you that's a good question. People today will probably doubt this, but I grew up, like you mentioned, blue-collar Southside Chicago, and I didn't grow up knowing who C.S. Lewis was or the Chronicles of Narnia. And today you'd think, especially in a Christian home, that's like almost impossible. You mentioned I teach at Asbury. I teach a Lewis class there. My students, this is often the first book that they read, you know, the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, or their parents read it to them. I have one student claim, and I have no reason to doubt that, her parents read the book to her while she was in the womb. Anyway, I did not grow up with the Chronicles of Narnia. I had this older brother who went off to college, and like older brothers everywhere, he came home and at Thanksgiving and threw this book on my bed. I was 16, I was a sophomore in high school, and he said, "Here, you should read this," right? And it was like no book I'd ever read before, and had this strange cover. It was The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. Some of our older listeners or audience here may remember what I call the Peter Max version. It was the one that came out in the 70s. The cover was sort of done in like Yellow Submarine kind of style. I still have it. I should have gotten it out. Anyway, so I read The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. I'm 16. My first experience with Lewis. It's like no book I've ever read. So I went to something, hold on, called the library, because there's no internet back then, right? And I asked the librarian, I said, my brother got me this book at college. Of course, there's no Amazon either to check things, right? Are there any other, has he written any other books? And the librarian, who was quite enlightened and lovely, she said, has he written any other books, right? So that, if you like The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, there's 6 more, Chronicles of Narnia 7-set series, and if you finish that, there's a space trilogy, there's books like Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain. So that sort of began my interest in Lewis. So, people think that somebody who's a Lewis scholar, has done a doctoral dissertation on him or something like that. Yeah, I teach a class on Lewis, but when I went to college, there was no Lewis class, right? So anyway, that's how I got started. Nobody, and I went to a church where people didn't know who Lewis was. There were no movies. Eventually, those old BBC ones came out that people either love or hate. As soon as you mention that they're a little dated, you'll soon say, "No, I love those. I love those." Anyway, eventually there were those early ones of the first 3 books, and then of course, finally the big series that we have now.
What is it, do you think, about C.S. Lewis that makes him so relatable to the average Christian or just the average person with, an imagination? What is it about him that was unique?
Yeah, I mean, you could probably say 5 or 6 reasons and still not have them all, right? But one of the things Lewis is very, very popular, and he's popular year after year after year. He's one of the few authors who's more popular now than when he was alive. And if you've read any books that are 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, they can get a little dated, right? So you're thinking, man, this doesn't really speak to me, or our tastes have changed or something. and he's one of these authors whose all of his books are still in print. I think there's a couple reasons for his popularity. One is, of course, people may not know this, but for most of his life, he wasn't a Christian. He was raised in a church, Church of Ireland, which is Church of England, when he grew up in Belfast. But he wouldn't say he had a genuine faith of his own, and by the time he was 12, he'd abandoned it. So he knew what Christianity looked like from the outside. It wasn't until he was in his early 30s that he began this gradual journey, either to Christianity or back to Christianity. And in a lovely story, people may or may not know that J.R. Tolkien played a big hand in bringing him back to Christ. So you could write an essay. I keep thinking I'll do so. How J.R. Tolkien saved Narnia, because without Tolkien, Lewis might not have been a Christian, and there may never have been Chronicles of Narnia. So he knew what Christianity looked like from the outside. The other thing I'll say about him is churches now want to do this thing called engaging culture, and that's a lovely phrase. We don't want to be separate and look down at them, but we want to engage them, and to do that you have to do the prep. And Lewis certainly did the prep. People may know that he got a triple first at Oxford in classical literature, in English literature, and in philosophy, so that when he began to write, he did his homework. I think I've got students, and I think college students are lovely for their enthusiasm, but lots of times they want to go out and save the world before they've really done their prep. So he did the prep. He knew what Christianity looked like from the outside. And I'll just tell you another one, and I don't mean to step on anybody's toes, but he made it clear that he was just another thirsty man saying, hey, I know where there's some water. Christians today sometimes, at least they come across as, you should be as holy as me, or, you poor awful sinner, let me come and save you, whereas Lewis always made it clear he was another sinner. He didn't suggest that his sins were any better or worse than anybody else's. And, when Christians take that, I'm just another thirsty person, but I know where there's some water attitude, I think it opens doors.
Yeah, even though he was so intelligent, he was really a genius level, I think that is really a great way of putting it, that he just related with people directly as another person, not as somebody who was this brilliant theologian. Let me ask you, his personal life, he had a lot of trauma and trouble in it. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, The Problem of Pain, and how that initiated his book, Mere Christianity?
Yeah, so he first off, he's trying to become a writer before he's a Christian, and he writes two, let's be honest, pretty bad books of poetry. If Lewis had not gone on to write better books, we'd not even have those books of poetry. But then he comes to faith, and something clicked. He found his voice. He found what he wanted to do. He first did a book called The Pilgrim's Regress, not that great, but then boom, The Problem of Pain comes out. And some people know C.S. Lewis now, although it's getting kind of old, through the movie Shadowlands, that Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. It's a great movie, and it does a lot of things really well, including showing us beautiful Oxford, which is just another whole story. But the suggestion in that film is that this was a guy who lived in an ivory tower, isolated from all the troubles and pains of the world, and that when he wrote The Problem of Pain, he was speaking in sort of a theoretical position from someone who didn't know pain until late in life he met and fell in love with this American Joy Gresham, and they fell in love, and it's a lovely story. She gets cancer, they pray over her, she recovers, they have 3 lovely years together, and then it comes back. And then he writes A Grief Observed, where he feels the red hot pain of grief. And I should just say, some people have the idea that Christians don't grieve. And St. Paul says, we do not grieve as others grieve, as those without hope. But he doesn't say we don't grieve. Of course we do. And Lewis offered a very honest reflection of what that felt like. But the problem of pain, he tackles it as a philosophical problem, but it's not one that he was unfamiliar with. His mother died when he was 9 years old. His father became very emotionally distant. He experienced lots of bullying in school. That's kind of a contemporary topic today, but man, he was very familiar with that. Had a tough, we would call middle school time. And then later in life, he went and fought in World War I, where he was wounded. One of his training partners was killed in battle, and they had made a pact that they would take care of each other's parents, surviving parents. So he took care of Patty Moore's mother throughout his life, and she was difficult. His brother was an alcoholic, so he knew pain himself, and yet he said, well, how can an all-powerful and all-loving God allow pain in the world? It's a great question. It's one that's been asked through the ages. It's one we still ask today. It's a great question. Everyone asks that question. If God is all loving and all powerful, why is there pain? Because, if there's pain, maybe he doesn't really love us. Or if he loves us, maybe he's not powerful enough to get rid of it. And he addresses it pretty well. So that book comes out, and because of that book, which sold in the thousands to start, it's sold millions now, but in start, the director of religious broadcasting at the BBC, James Welch, read that book, said, man, this is a great book. He writes Lewis a letter in 1941 and said, would you consider broadcasting on the BBC? And so that's the other thing some people may not know until they start to study it, that Mere Christianity was all broadcast over the BBC during World War II. Lewis's voice was the second most recognized voice in all of England, only second after Churchill.
I think that is so fascinating, and I definitely didn't know that before starting to read your material. I didn't know that. I thought it was just absolutely fascinating. Okay, so what then, after the radio broadcasts, which spanned several years, isn't that correct?
Yeah, he agreed to do 4, and everybody, including Lewis himself, was astonished at how popular they were, right? People were tuning in, they were writing him letters. Anyway, they begged for another series, and then another one, another one. So he went on to do 4 different series of them. They were broadcast as little small books. Every so often people will see these used books floating around, but then they were gathered together, and in 1952 came out as Mere Christianity that we know today.
So what made Mere Christianity, what made the radio broadcast, what made that whole the whole writings that he did such a seminal work?
Yeah, and again, we could give lots of reasons, but I'll give you a few that I think stick out. We have it today, but back then that's all they had. They would broadcast the service, and the service meant the Anglican service, like an evensong that you might hear, and that's great if you're already a Christian. It's great if you're a shut-in and can't make it, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to reach people who have decided that's not for them. So picture the BBC that had been broadcasting services from Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's Cathedral, lovely music, lovely liturgy, all of a sudden saying to this Oxford English professor, could you write something new and try something new? So he broke with this tradition of just broadcasting the service, just recording it, and that's what went out. The other thing that he did that I thought was new was he began where the people were. The opening line, Mere Christianity, everyone has heard people quarreling. All over England said, well, yeah, we have. What about it? He says, well, when you quarrel, what are you really doing? You say you did something wrong. The other person says, no, I didn't do that wrong, and you talk about it. But behind that whole thing is, and we all agree that there is this moral code. Well, where did that moral code come from? Who made that? Why do you both agree on it? And that's where he began. So he began where they were. He didn't just do a service. And I guess the third thing that I think was really kind of interesting is he worked him through step by step. He didn't begin with Bible verses. And I suppose in some cases Bible verses may be effective, but he made a point of saying, look, I'm going to start with something you agree on, not trying to convince you of the Bible. I guess the other thing that you could really say is people think of Lewis as, well, let's be honest, he is sort of a dinosaur. He used this nib pen all of his life, and his brother typed up his letters on a type machine. So he's a bit of a dinosaur and a bit of a throwback, a bit of old-fashioned, but he made use of appropriate technology. I mean, this was the first big Christian use of a wireless device, and the wireless, of course, being the radio. So I don't know. We're still even today finding ways to use appropriate technology. I tell my students, when Jesus wanted to talk to people and there was a big crowd on the thing, he used technology, right? He got in a boat and went out to sea a little bit. So anyway.
You're making a natural amphitheater that way. That's so so cool. All right, so how can our society today relate to the 1940s British era society that found C.S. Lewis's thoughts on Christianity and theology and discipleship so influential in their personal spiritual growth?
Yeah, and I'll just say this may go back to your first question. Lewis is kind of this strange figure, and maybe people will kind of relate to what I'm saying. So I have a friend who goes to a seeker church, and that's great, right? But the lesson is always, for young Christians or non-Christians, and I kind of wonder sometimes, where does someone who's a mature Christian get fed and get nourished? St. Paul talks about babies requiring the milk of the word, and then when you're older, you have a different need. And that's appropriate. Like, just like a beginning swimmer takes a beginning swimmer class, an advanced swimmer. Anyway, Lewis has this unique ability to both speak to people who aren't Christians, to help explain things to new Christians, and this is the craziest of all, serious, mature Christians, people who have been Christians for years and years, people who have studied this, can still read Lewis and get stuff from him. So he seems to speak on all those levels in the way that materials today seem geared to one of those. Here's for seekers, here's if you're a new Christian, and if you've been, so anyway, he speaks on all those levels. I'll tell you the other thing he does is he really speaks about the human heart and the human condition. Well, this is something that hasn't changed, since the Greeks and Romans, right? The human heart doesn't change. And so when he talks about those things, he's talking about eternal things. I will say another thing, though. People who have picked up mere Christianity and found it a bit dense, and trust me, people have, and they feel, gosh, I must not be very bright, I can't read this. It is dense. It is dense, particularly for us today. We're separated by almost 75 years from those original broadcasts. So there's a distance of time, and to us who don't live in England, there's a distance of culture. And that's one of the reasons that we made the study guide and we made the DVD to help unpack it a bit. And, I've talked to people who say, I've read the Chronicles of Narnia, love them, and I went to Mere Christianity, and, it was too hard for me. And I said, well, yeah, and that's part of the reason. It's the time and place. So here's a way that people, whether they're in a group at church or on their own, can open it up and make sense of it and apply it to their lives and not feel it to be threatening or anything.
Okay, I want to remind our viewers, leave us your questions. We want to hear from you on the live fire page. Anything that you want to ask Devin, let us know, and I'll ask your question for you. Also, Devin, okay, so you've got all this fascination with C.S. Lewis and this education as you've studied him. What was the inspiration for this particular book and the accompanying study that's hosted by Eric Metaxas, who I just love? I think he's so fascinating. What was your inspiration?
Well, I'll tell you this. Mere Christianity covers a lot of the same points in a different form that we find in the Chronicles of Narnia. What's the purpose of life? What is the good life? What's it mean to be a leader? What happens when we die? Where is our faith resting on? Is there good and evil in the world? And if you like those themes in the Chronicles of Narnia, and I would say want to go deeper, want to find a way to make more sense of them, and I don't know if it's more sense, it's a different kind of sense. So in the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis uses the imagination, and in Mere Christianity, he uses our reason. And we're called to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, which could be our imagination, and all our mind. And I'll just say this, we have a tendency to do one or the other. The church that I grew up with, you mentioned that, blue collar, south side of Chicago, man, they loved God with all their heart, but didn't do so well on the other ones, right? And if people are out there hungering to use their mind to love God, longing for, to not just feel love for Jesus, but to put their mind into use and love God with their mind, Lewis is a great place to start. And so these books help let anybody do that, or a group in church do that, or if they've already done it, to take it deeper or broader. So, there's something magical when you do what Lewis does, which is to love God with your whole self, your imagination, your heart, and your mind.
We were talking just earlier about how he is not an impenetrable theologian. He's somebody that people were able to relate to, even though he had such high intelligence, and he was able to relate to people on all levels. So let me ask you, why then do we need a study guide for C.S. Lewis? Why is that important to us?
Yeah, and part of it is in some ways we don't, right? I mean, the Lewis estate and Douglas Gresham were very serious about not interpreting Lewis, right? In other words, that's always the danger, is to start putting yourself into it. And the team that worked on this always tried to let Lewis speak for himself, but just unpack him and say, what does this mean to you? And I'll just say this, what does it mean to you? Jesus talks about being hearers of the word but not doers. In discussing Mere Christianity, we really wanted to discuss it and say, and what do you think, and what do you see, and what makes sense to you here? And that kind of moves in that direction. It kind of says, here's what he's talking about. Here's maybe where we see it today, still the same thing. And now what sense do you make of it? So we've got a lot of discussion questions. You don't read very far before you hit one of these. And hopefully, if you're doing this at home by yourself, you might write down some of the answers. If you're doing it in a group, you find out what other people say. And I'll just say this, we've all been in Bible studies, which, man, I got so much out of that because of what other people had to add. So, and you also get this, you've had that experience too, well, so have I. Or someone says, well, here's kind of how I answer that question. Oh, that's a great answer. I'll have to use that. Or here's where I've been frustrated. So, I think we're meant to do this sort of thing together. So the title of the thing, Discussing Mere Christianity, really means we're supposed to discuss it. I want to say a point about that theologian thing. It's hard to imagine today, but Lewis got some pushback from, professional theologians, right? Guys who had a PhD in theology, and they were kind of miffed that he was trying to explain the gospel to people. And, it's usually best for an author to stay out of that sort of thing, and he did. But at one point, I think he'd had enough where he just said, look, I'm going to just tell you how it is. If you guys had really been doing your job, if you had been telling the average guy, the millions and millions of people that Christ loved and came to save, if you'd been telling them about God's love and what it means, I would have had to do this. He was an English professor, right? But he said, the average guy can't, what you write doesn't make any sense. And trust me, there are people in our audience today who picked up a theology book and like, what in the world are they talking about? All these big words I've never heard of, or they mean them in a different sense, or it seems so dry and boring. How can God be dry and boring? So anyway, Lewis, as an outsider of Christianity and outsider of the professional theology world, found that he had something to say.
I love it. That's so great. So this is a study that, if you wanted to, you could do this on your own, but it is a best to be done in a group setting, correct? But either way, it would work.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, there's a DVD, and that's, even if you're sitting at home, you can put the DVD in your computer or your DVD player and interact with Eric Metaxas and see all the great Lewis sites. By the way, I want to say this. I'll make a plug. Eric does such a great job, and the film crew team did such a great job. If you've never been to Oxford, if you've never been to C.S. Lewis's house or the church he went to, this is not only a great sort of unpacking of Mere Christianity. I think it's the best Lewis's life documentary that's come out in years. You get this armchair trip to Oxford, for the price of a disc. So it's really good that way.
That's what I've been really enjoying about it myself. Is I haven't been to Oxford in about 15 years, and it's just incredible to see the sites themselves. They're just gorgeous. All right, so this has 8 sessions. Tell us, what are we going to be talking about in Discussing Mere Christianity?
Yeah, and that's another thing to point out. Mere Christianity is kind of long for a modern audience, the book itself. I mean, it's a couple hundred pages, and they're all thick, and there's no pictures, right? So one of the decisions we made early on was to say, well, if we can narrow it down to 8 of the biggest lessons, 8 of the highlights. Now, we hope that people will go on and read the whole thing by themselves. Each of the 8 sessions has 2 chapters. Well, 2 chapters isn't too much, because remember, this is what Lewis had to say. Some of the talks were 10 minutes, some were 15. So it's basically, if he could say it in 15 minutes, you can probably read it in 15 minutes. So each chapter takes 2 chapters from Mere Christianity, and you're going to have a little homework, right? This is not meant to replace Lewis's own comments. So you read 2 chapters, maybe 8 to 12 pages. Then you go into the book and work through those chapters there and watch the video, and there'll be some discussion questions that point to the video. And we've got some great people there. Our audience will know. Philip Yancey, Alistair McGrath, Douglas Gresham, as you mentioned, is in there, who also will bring it to life. So it's, and the other thing we've tried to do is to say, look, most Sunday school classes or Wednesday night groups or Sunday evening groups are about an hour. And so this is something that you can talk about, watch a 24-minute video, and finish in sort of an hour. I mean, maybe unless people get going like crazy and talking, hopefully. But it's the kind of thing that you can do in one setting. So we've cut it up into nice chunks, and we've tried not to make it overwhelming. We assume that this is for people who'd like a little bit of help in really getting to the heart of Mere Christianity.
Well, I have to give my plug that I think it's very doable. These chunks, it's like having a 30-minute discussion with him and digging into the material just a little bit, not so much that you're overwhelmed intellectually, but I think it's wonderful. All right, we have this great question from Laura Joy that I would love for you to address. Is this course workload for a mixed crowd, in other words, non-believers, skeptics, believers, etc., or is it geared towards Christians alone?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think it can work for a mixed crowd. We've got a few questions that may be more relatable to a group of Christians. We envisioned churches using this, but to the extent your church, has some seekers there, or maybe spouses or friends who don't know the Lord, it's like Lewis himself. It tries to be very non-judgmental, right? So it doesn't ask a heavy-handed question that's going to put people who aren't believers ill at ease or look down on them or anything like that. So I think it could work with a group of skeptics. It could work with a mixed group. It could work a group with beginning believers or more serious, just like Mere Christianity itself. So we tried to mirror Lewis's thing. Picture this, it's Wednesday night at 7:45, and you turn on the radio in World War II London, and who's listening? It could be a group in a pub. It could be a pastor at church and his group there. It could be people at home. So just like Lewis spoke to a very general audience, as we took Mere Christianity and unpacked it, I think we're unpacking it for a general audience, a broad general audience.
Well, just like you were talking about in the question of the problem of pain, so many of the questions that he discussed and the issues that he raised are topics that people are going to struggle with or question. How can there be a good God when all of this is going on? Are very relatable, no matter if you're a believer or not a believer. And I think a lot of people who aren't believers are going to be digging into those questions and fascinated to see what a Christian's going to say anyway, which is part of what makes him such an interesting character, that he's able to speak to all groups. Let me ask you this question. What other topics are we going to be talking about? We're talking about the Christian virtue of hope. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, and let me walk through the chapters just for people who haven't picked it up yet. Lewis looks at our sense. Then these are all Lewis's topics. Our sense of right and wrong. Where does it come from? We all have this sense of right and wrong. And by the way, what a contemporary topic! This idea that we think there's a right and wrong. For example, we look at things that are happening in the Middle East, people committing atrocities. Well, who are we to say what they're doing is wrong? They think it's right. Well, trust me, even people who don't believe in God want to say, no, that's wrong. It's not just because I think so. It's because it is wrong. Well, where does that come from? Lewis has that in our second session. Well, what's behind that sense of right and wrong, right? And then talk about the problem of pain. Where does that come from? In session 4, we look at the problem of free will. God wants us to have free will. How do you have free will without the ability to choose something wrong? And of course, the virtue of hope that you mentioned to talk about. Lewis is great about that. He says, look, I've got this longing in me, and there's a topic that really bridges non-believers, this longing for something more. Where does that come from? Well, his solution is, I must be made for another world.
Yeah, that's fantastic. All right, I want to remind you all that you can get an extra 10% off plus free shipping on Discussing Mere Christianity using the code DB10 at store.faithgateway.com for a limited time only. Devin, do you have any, I know we have to wrap up this conversation. I wish we could talk a lot longer, and I am very excited to finish the rest of this because it's absolutely fascinating, and I wish I could audit your course, and I love that you mentioned that watching this and reading this is basically auditing your course. Is there anything to say?
Yeah, I'll just tell this. C.S. Lewis fans, like Tolkien fans, tend to be a bit fanatical, and trust me, my wife has claimed she's been Narnia'd out. She's had enough for a lifetime. And I just want to say, and we all have this. We all have passions that our friends or spouses don't share. The whole point of this book is to honor the person that C.S. Lewis honored. Not just to honor him, although there is much to point to, but to honor the one he honored and to point to the one that he pointed to. That's what's behind all of this. And really, that's our goal. He's pointing to somebody. He's honoring somebody. And that's what we want to do. Point to the same one he's pointing to.
Devin, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our live fire audience, everyone who joined in the conversation below. Devin, thank you for being with us. I'm very, very excited about this book, and if you don't have your copy, you could also go on Study Gateway and use the 30-day trial to watch the videos and get the study guide and dig into it. Devin, thanks so much. It was wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, bye, everyone.